Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Spiritual Research Center here in Hamilton, Ontario. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am a biblical scholar, author, musician, and a bit of a game designer. And today we're going to be talking about simulation theory, the meaning of life, and Judaism. So, the very short story is that simulation theory is a rather popular idea in philosophy right now, which says that we might be in some kind of a simulation. Okay? And the cool thing is that when we factor in some research from neuroscience, we can start to understand the purpose of this simulation. And Judaism also has a number of interesting puzzle pieces as well, especially when it comes to Kabbalah. So in this video, I'm going to be wrapping all of that together. We're going to be looking at simulation theory. Then we're going to be looking at a principle in neuroscience known as the free energy principle. We're going to examine the idea of whether or not we might be in a video game. And then we're going to look at what Kabbalah and Judaism has to say about simulation theory. Okay, so let's get started. First, simulation theory. This was first proposed by a philosopher named Nick Bostrom in 2003, which is about the time that The Matrix came out. Okay, so between The Matrix and simulation theory, a lot of people have become very enamored by the idea that we might be in some kind of simulation. Nick Bostrom, basically in 2003, proposed, basically a logical argument that suggests that if a civilization becomes capable of creating conscious simulations, it could generate so many simulated beings that a randomly chosen conscious entity would almost certainly be in a simulation. So he basically set up some kind of logical trap, if you read the paper, and he said that based on the logic of things, it's almost certain that we are living in some kind of simulation. Okay, so fairly interesting idea. If you read the paper, you can understand kind of the logic that he used to come to this, but it's really taken off. So Neil deGrasse Tyson is a popular astrophysicist, and he said that the likelihood of this hypothesis being correct is better than 50-50. And he said, I wish I could summon a strong argument against it, but I can't find any. Okay. Elon Musk, I know he's a big techie himself, and he said that the argument for the simulation hypothesis is quite strong. So a lot of people are really enamored with this idea of simulation theory, and there's been books written about it as well. One of them is called The Simulation Hypothesis by Rizwan Virk. And in an interview, Mr. Virk said that the most important question related to simulation theory is whether we are non-player characters or player characters in the video game. If we are player characters, then that means we are just playing a character inside the video game of life. I think many of us would like to know this. We would also want to know the parameters of the game so that we could better understand it and better navigate it. Okay, so if we are in a simulation, if we are in, some kind of video game, right, we would want to know the rules. We would want the user's manual, right? Because life is very confusing and difficult, and having the user's manual would be great. Okay, so where could we find such a thing? Now, when it comes to simulation theory, there's an outstanding problem in philosophy. Okay, philosophers who are working on simulation theory, they have a bit of a problem, and that is the reason for the simulation. Why would we be in a simulation? No one really knows the answer to this. So some people have hypothesized that we're in an ancestor simulation for historical study. We're in an educational or experimental simulation. Maybe it's just for entertainment. Maybe it's some kind of punishment or a test, right? Like philosophers operating within their current paradigm are not able to figure this out. Okay? However, when we factor in neuroscience, when we factor in recent research in neuroscience, the reason for the simulation becomes a lot more clear. So there's a neuroscientist named Carl Friston who has released something that he calls the free energy principle. And basically, he looked at the physics of how things work in the brain, and he determined that the brain essentially tries to minimize surprise. Okay, so the world is very confusing. There's a lot of information out there, right? And your brain's job is to figure out what's going on. Okay, and in order to figure out what's going on, or as a consequence of figuring out what's going on, you become less surprised by what happens in your life. Okay, so imagine, for example, if you're a hunter in the jungle thousands of years ago, and you've got your spear and you're walking through the jungle, right? If a lion or a tiger or something jumps out at you, that's surprise. Okay, and surprise is not usually good. Sometimes surprises are good, but very often surprises are not good. And so Carl Friston has proposed that our brains actually just try to minimize surprise in order to feel safe, in order for us to be safe and, live good lives. And, this is a bit of a tangent, but there's basically two ways that you can minimize surprise. One is by controlling your environment, which is what a lot of people try to do. And the second way to minimize surprise is to improve your mental model of the world, to improve your understanding of the world. Okay? So basically, Carl Friston and his work has shown us that the universe is kind of like a signal sent to the brain. The brain then tries to decode the universe to minimize surprise. And in theory, the brain is always growing in response to new information. Okay? And so when you factor this into the simulation hypothesis, you get a really interesting result, and that is we're in a form of video game. Okay, it's not just a simulation for idle purposes. It seems like we're actually in a video game. Okay, and specifically, the video game is designed to help us grow. Okay, any simulation that we're in, it's designed to grow our consciousness, regardless of any other reason that it might have been created. Okay, an essential element of the universe is personal growth, learning new things, updating your mental model, okay, becoming more sophisticated, becoming more conscious, okay? And interestingly, when you think about how life is, designed and how life operates, it's very engaging. Life is always throwing things at us, right? Life is always throwing things at us. Like maybe your car breaks down, you have to figure that out. Or maybe you've got an important test coming up in school and you've got to learn. And maybe you're in a relationship and you're trying to make that work. So there's always challenges. There's always things going on in our lives that challenge us. Okay, and this actually puts us in a permanent state of flow. Okay, so you might be familiar with flow states, but flow states are something that are used in video games to, make sure that our attention is captured and we're thinking about what we're doing. And being in a flow state brings focus, pleasure, and enjoyment. Okay? And even though life is very difficult and it's not always enjoyable, the act of solving problems and overcoming challenges and everything is immensely pleasurable. Okay? And that's what life is. It's just a series of challenges that we are supposed to overcome. Okay? And so I would propose to you that we are in a simulation designed to help us grow, okay, to help us become more conscious, to help us learn, okay? And in that paradigm, learning is winning, okay? Most people know that the point of life is not to get rich or be famous or to gratify their desires. And from neuroscience and philosophy, we can at least know that one meaning of life is to learn and grow. And the cool thing is that people who have near-death experiences, they often share that one of the things they learned when they were off in the spiritual realms is that life is designed to help us learn lessons, especially about loving others. Okay? So I think that's really interesting. Now, related to the near-death experiences, um, one famous philosopher of consciousness named David Chalmers, he has concluded that if we're in a simulation, then that means there must be a creator of the simulation, which sounds an awful lot like theism, right? And you might not believe me, but here's a clip of David Chalmers talking about just that.
Touched on this in your introductions, and some people may argue that if the simulation implies some intelligent designer, that it's basically the equivalent to some ontotheological view, where there's no, thus it's like not really different from a religion that postulates some sort of an omnipotent designer, a deity of some sort. Others might contend that the simulation doesn't necessarily require some intelligent agent to run it, and that it could arise from some sort of natural phenomena. Do you see any distinction between this sort of naturalistic explanation for a possible simulation versus a theological one? We'll start. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way that David put it in his talk that like the simulation hypothesis is sort of like an amalgamation of two things, right? Where you believe like the world is computational in a certain appropriate sense, and there was some creator who made a choice to set that in motion, right? You could imagine that this universe is just arises, mechanistically out of a different universe with, utterly different laws. But like in a certain sense, that is what physics already says. Right. So it's like the classical world, is built out of this quantum world that looks totally different from anything that a priori thought about. Right. It was like, is classical physics just all, a big simulation being run by quantum physics? Well, like you could view it that way. Like, I personally don't see where to draw a firm line between that sort of thing, just levels of emergence and one world simulating another world.
Okay.
I think there's two. You can define the simulation hypothesis the way you were suggesting, so that it doesn't actually require a simulator. So, interesting question. Just say it turns out that we're contained in a world where just through totally by chance a simulation of our universe came into existence. Then is the simulation hypothesis true? Well, I think this is it's a verbal question. We could stipulate in my book. I stipulate that the simulation hypothesis requires a simulator who designed and created this intentionally. So this would not count.
Okay, so we're in a simulation. There may well be a creator of the simulation. We kind of know the reason for the simulation, to learn and grow and become more conscious. But this still leaves us with a problem, okay? Where's the user's manual? Where are the instructions for this simulation? How are we supposed to best live our lives? Right? Where's the user's manual? Right? I think a lot of people would like a user's manual to life. And the interesting thing is that Judaism has answers. Okay, so if you look at my channel, you'll see that I've got a bunch of proofs for Judaism. I've got some philosophical arguments for God. I've got a blockchain-based proof for Judaism and the Torah. I've got an example of a biblical prophecy that came true with the Nuremberg trials. And I've also got an extensive breakdown of how and when the Exodus happened. Okay, so we've got the proof for Judaism, and you can check that out on my channel. But let's just move forward with the understanding that Judaism is demonstrably true. Okay, what does that mean for simulation theory? What does that mean for this video game that we're in? Okay, so the interesting thing is that Kabbalah teaches about something called the Ein Sof and Tzimtzum. Okay, so basically God is the Ein Sof, the infinite light. And he contracted himself, which is Tzimtzum, in order to filter the light down into what we experience as the material world. Okay, and the material world, the universe that we're in, is referred to as an elem, or a concealment. Okay, concealment, simulation, right? Somewhat similar. So Kabbalah is kind of teaching that we're in a form of simulation, and it's been teaching that for thousands of years. Okay, And the reason that we're in the simulation is because we need free will. Okay, we need the free will to make our own decisions and move through life and learn and grow. And if we were exposed to the truth of existence, which is the Ein Sof, we wouldn't have free will because it would be so obvious. So we're put into an elem, a concealment, a simulation, where God's light and God's presence is not as obvious. And that gives us the room for free will so we can learn and grow on our own. Okay. Now, about 3,300 years ago, something very important happened, which was the revelation at Mount Sinai. Okay, so the Jewish nation, after leaving Egypt, stood at the bottom of a mountain and got the Torah. Okay, and the Torah, as you probably know, has a bunch of commandments in it. Okay, and we'll get to this in a second, but the meaning of Torah, like the word, the translation of it, is instruction. Okay, so the Jews received the instruction manual 3,300 years ago. And it's really interesting because when you look at Jewish literature, it starts to sound a